I think we're going to go ahead and get started. According to my watch, it is 11 o'clock. First, I want to start out. My name is Lacey Brown. I'm a gerontologist with South Dakota State University Extension. My colleague, Jane Strumman, is from North Dakota State University Extension. I want to let you know that this webinar will be recorded, so you will be able to go review the content again if you choose after it's done. We will also email all the slides out to you after the webinar today. And in that email, there will be a link to the evaluation for this webinar. And we really appreciate you giving us some feedback about this webinar. In that evaluation, it will ask if you would like to be notified about upcoming webinars. Your email and name will only be used to notify you about webinars. There will be other content that comes to you. With respect to your questions, please hold those to the end, and we will discuss them as a group at the end. So this webinar will provide an overview of some of the important topics related to older age and end of life that can create conflict, especially if they're not approached in a sensitive way to meet the needs of everybody who's concerned. So at this point, I'm going to turn it over to Jane, and she will start us off.
Thank you, Lacey. Difficult conversations can really be defined as situations where the needs, the wants, opinions, or perceptions of the participants are really diverse and often include strong feelings and emotions. Individuals involved in difficult conversation have strong feelings and emotions because they have a lot at stake, and they fear the consequences, such as family conflict. These conversations can be difficult for all parties involved, regardless of who really initiates the conversation. Sometimes it's a parent who wants to engage their adult children in these talks, and it's actually the adult children that aren't comfortable or ready to think about their parents aging. Today, we're focusing on helping an adult child feel more comfortable initiating these conversations, but really the content should be beneficial for anyone wanting to explore how to have these discussions with family members or loved ones. There are several essential conversations to have with your parents as they're aging. The first one being the financial talk. This can be touchy, especially if your parents are really private about this topic, which can often happen. But if you might be in the situation where you need to assist them, especially if something unexpected happened, like an accident or a diagnosis, it's really important for you to have some information about their financial situation. And even if it's starting with where would you find a file about some of the key information that they have, sometimes that's a good starting point. But it's important, to know if they have enough money to live on, enough money for the future. Have they thought about costs of long-term care, should they need it? Have they made their wishes known in a will or other legal arrangements for their affairs? A second talk involves their living arrangements. In the future, it's important to know, do they plan to stay at their home? Is that their preference? Do they plan to move in with an adult child? Or would they like to downsize and move into a retirement community or a smaller home? Any of these decisions will require looking closely at things like their health, their finances, what is their desired lifestyle, and what kind of assistance or level of care might they need. If they prefer to remain in their home, there's several things that should be considered, such as, how functional is their home? Can they navigate safely around it? What about the location? Is the home in a community that has easy access to their family and friends and things that they enjoy? How about just the safety of their home or where it's located? Will they be able to get help in an emergency? And of course, services and supports are important. Are there nearby services that they could get if they wanted or needed, such as, medical care, shopping, entertainment, affordability. Can they afford to live in a private home and pay for all of the associated expenses? Maybe a move is necessary, maybe not. Maybe all that is needed is some home modification. And then if they prefer to move in the future at some point, whether it's downsizing or moving to a retirement community, that presents a whole another set of questions. What's important to them, being near their family and friends, the cost, amenities available, things like that. The third issue would be medical or health care. What medical issues might they have? What medications do they take? Do they have a healthcare power of attorney appointing somebody to make decisions for them if they're not able to do so? That's really important to have those things in place. The end of life talk, it's difficult to talk about death and dying, and especially difficult to think about your parents dying. But it's really important to find out what their wishes are if they would have a terminal or end stage illness. Do they have an advance directives or a living will? And if they do, where are they? It's important that those are shared with people that will be responsible for making some decisions on their behalf. And the last one we've added is really about the family legacy. And I think this one is really important. What do your family members, your loved ones, want you to remember about them? Legacy is really about an older adult looking at their life and determining, has their life meant something? Has it been important? And this can really be accomplished by having conversations about what's important that you remember about them. What are those family stories that are important, those treasured recipes or heirlooms that they want to pass on to future generations? And it's just as important as the other issues as well. So it's important to talk about all these issues, but there are often many barriers to actually having these conversations or talks. And, fear of confrontation or the unknown or undesired outcomes, those can be really difficult. We just don't know what our parents will think about that. Fear of invasion of privacy, such as a conversation about finances. Will parents be angry about that and feel like that's none of your business? A lack of confidence and knowledge, that's kind of why we're having this conversation today. Often it's just not knowing what to say or how to say it. And so hopefully we'll cover some of those strategies. Concerns about timing. Is it too soon to have these conversations? Often that's, we're not sure when we should. And then distance, if family members or adult children live at a distance, it might feel uncomfortable to have these conversations when you're not just face to face. And so how do you do that? And we certainly know that waiting for those family or the holiday gatherings isn't the most appropriate time to talk about some of these issues. If families have some complicated dynamics, they have some relationships that are not in the best situation, having these types of talks can make it even more complicated. And then assumptions that wishes will be just implicitly known by family or close friends. And this can lead to some problems because when we make assumptions about anything, I guess, but we just really want to be clear that, especially when there's many family members involved, the chances are that not everyone's going to understand things the same way will be important. So if these conversations are are challenging, why should we still try to have them? Well, there are many reasons. You know, having open and frank discussions with your parents really help avoid stress and the uncertainty about the future, and they can provide you with an increased peace of mind. You know, it's really a good idea to talk with parents about their wishes now instead of when they become older or they're unable to express their wishes. And it's always wise to try to avoid making a decision when a crisis happens. For example, if somebody has a stroke or there's been a car accident and all of a sudden you're faced with having to make decisions and you don't have full information about your parents' situation or their wishes. These talks will really help plan the future, help resolve conflicts within family, and take the decision burden off of you. And really, I think the most important thing, it really helps assure that your parents' wishes and preferences will be honored. And that's why we're wanting to have these conversations. So with that, we kind of look at, you know, the whole conversation process. Any type of important conversation should be given thoughtful consideration. And the topics that we've just talked about here should require sufficient planning before the conversation actually happens. And then the use of strategies during the conversation is important to increase successful outcomes. And then there's the important follow-up tasks after the conversation. So we're going to look at each of these steps in the conversation process. So before the conversation happens, there's some important things to do is to get the facts and organize your thoughts. You know, you want to be prepared if you're going to want to talk about a certain maybe issue, whether it's maybe a living arrangement. You're going to want to gather some information and be prepared with some options if that presents itself. And so you might need to do some of your research before you have this conversation. It's also important to really understand why you want to have the conversation. What's the purpose or objective? Like I mentioned, maybe the objective is you're concerned about their living situation and whether their home is the most appropriate for them, and you're wanting to gather some information about housing options and the cost of housing. But to be very clear about what you hope to accomplish. Practice, you might think, well, why do I need to do that? But it's really important to be prepared, and probably more so, it's important to start with a very calm mindset, because you know your attitude can really, toward the conversation, can influence the outcome of it. In many different conversations, someone is likely to overreact, and the worst thing would be for two people overreacting. So we want to prepare ourselves and practice with that calm mindset, and then set the stage for the conversation. Who do you want involved? Maybe you need to engage other family members or friends as appropriate. And then what about the timing? Are you going to select a time or a place? Or are you going to look for some natural windows of opportunity where the conversation could naturally come up? But it's important to be patient and do not force the subject as well. And then to understand that the conversation will take multiple discussions. Most important decisions are for something in the future, and people need time to process. So we need to remember that. And then conversation starter strategies. There's ideas, and you could maybe think of a situation that has happened with your coworker's parent, and you look for an opportunity to weave that into a conversation discussion with your parent. And we're going to talk about this more in a later slide, so that's all I'll say about that at this point. So those are some of the things we need to do before the conversation. Now let's take a look at what needs to happen during the conversation. Well, we need to start with just being respectful and considerate. We really need to empathize by putting ourselves in our parents' shoes. How would this conversation make them feel? Would we be scared? talking about our future. How would you feel if you were no longer independent? Would you want to talk about death? If you could no longer work or enjoy your activities and things, social activities you once did, how would you feel? I mean, to put yourself in their shoes is really important. Second is to listen. You really need to focus here on hearing what they're saying and not what we're saying. Your genuine attention will encourage the other person to elaborate. And then paraphrasing and repeating back what we've heard. It's good to ask for clarification, such as, I'm not sure what you mean. Can you help me better understand? Asking those types of questions. And then being aware of our body language and word choice. Speak more slowly, which allows you to react better or focus on finding a solution. Anything that slows the situation down will make you think instead of react. Also, it's important for aging adults to maintain control of their lives, and choosing the words that we use will help them feel like they're fully in charge, sometimes in the midst of many losses in their life. And so some of those words that can help older adults really feel like they're still managing their life or in control are, the managing, guiding, directing, assigning, or delegating. Some of those words that you choose are really important. Body language. Be relaxed. Face the other person. Make eye contact. Keep your hands folded in your lap versus, having your arms folded across your chest. Watch for some nonverbal cues from the other person. Are they relaxed? Does the conversation seem to unsettle them? Are they showing signs of nervousness, like fiddling or wringing their hands? We need to be aware of that. And then to realize that silence is okay. You don't actually need to talk. Sometimes it's important to have time to process and think about things. And then the last point I'll just make about this during the conversation process is that don't be surprised if there are some negative reactions. There might be some things like refusal or anger or denial. A parent might need to express anger or anxiety over these preparations. There might be some bitterness at discovering that their life isn't turning out or the way that they wanted. They might make some accusations or blame at themselves, at you, at their spouse, but let their parent vent these frustrations. It's probably a process of grieving too, some of those losses. But most importantly, ask questions, encourage them to continue talking, and approach the conversation with curiosity rather than judgment. So, we've had the conversation, and so are you done? Well, there are some things to think about after the conversation. Realize the conversation is perhaps one of many that will be needed. Older adults need time and space to process important life decisions. Many of these decisions are the results of losses, whether it's a loss of their good health, or maybe they've lost a spouse or some of their independence. Maybe that it might mean losing their home. They need time to maybe grieve these losses and adapt and move forward. So be patient is a key here. Acknowledge maybe the positive exchanges that did happen during the conversation, and then plan for those follow-up conversations. And it's also important to be transparent with other family members. And one of the ways you can do this is by keeping notes. Be ready during the conversation to record your parents' thoughts, and it'll make it easier for future conversations and for updating siblings and other family members. And your notes can really help prompt future discussions as well. And then don't pressure. The goal is to have your parents set up plans for their future. And we might not agree with how they handle things, but their plan is better than no plan. So just don't pressure. Like I said, it does take time. And then what happens if the conversation did not go well at all? Well, maybe we just need to back off and re-examine. Were the ideas or topics presented in a rushed way? Did we not have all the relevant information? Was the timing or the setting inappropriate? Maybe we just need to return to a neutral position or drop the subject for the time being. And maybe our parents are just not ready to talk about the issue yet. One of the things we can do is just redraft the plan. Maybe we need to do that by reframing the conversation in a different way or at a less hectic pace. Were certain words or certain topics or certain assumptions more upsetting than we anticipated? We need to select other options and to see if they have a better reaction. And we need to prepare for future conversations by doing our homework. And of course, if there appears to be where there is great conflict, and there might be a time or a place for a mediator, a professional mediator that could help family members to have these conversations. And that mediator could be, you know, an advisor, an attorney, a financial advisor, a social worker, a counselor, maybe somebody from the faith community leader that might be able to fill that role. So those are some of the things to think about after the conversation. And at this point, I will turn it back over to Lisi.
Thank you, Jane. That was awesome. I appreciate you helping us understand kind of the definition of what a difficult conversation is, and then increasing our knowledge about some of those barriers and the benefits to overcoming those barriers, and kind of giving us that big overview of what does this difficult conversation process look like. Now we're going to talk about some more specific tips and strategies that may improve the quality of those difficult conversations, and help ensure that each participant kind of walks away with feeling heard and understood. And these different ideas, as Jane said, maybe you do one approach and it doesn't work. So maybe you take a step back and think of another approach to initiate the conversation. So that's kind of what we're going to talk about now. So I hope you have your chat box ready. So I'd love for a couple of you to type what you think. So take a look at this diagram. When you have to make a decision, I want you to think about yourself. We have the vertical axis. So once you have enough information, then you'll decide. Or either I get into this soon, or I tune out. The other ones are the horizontal, where you're left alone and let's talk. So each of us kind of falls in one of these quadrants. You know, me, I tend to be a person who likes to be alone and do a lot of research whenever I'm making a decision. So I want you to look at this diagram, and are you going to be alone, get lots of information, then decide? Are you going to talk to a person and maybe decide pretty quickly on a decision? So take a few minutes and think about it. I'll give you about 60 seconds. And if you're willing to, we'll wait till I get to the next slide. So think about it for 60 seconds, and then we'll jump to the next slide. I don't know if that was 60. I forgot to look. It's okay though. All right, so this diagram explains what each area is. We have some people that are more spontaneous in how they make decisions. They move from goal to goal easily without a lot of thought, and they make their decisions quick. Their goals are also a little bit more flexible. Some people are a little bit more systematic. They deliberately establish goals. They're not likely to deviate from their goals. Some people do the process externally, so that means they have conversations, whereas other people will do it internally. So does anyone want to type where they were on the grid? Were they an SY-I? And personally for myself, I think I do like to think privately quite a bit, but I do arrive at a point where I've got to talk it out with somebody else. Heather says she was SYE, so she's systematic external. We got an SYI, systematic internal. We got to have someone spontaneous in the group. SY external. Awesome. Well, this is really helpful to remember. I fall there some days. Wonderful. I love it. Me too. What's really helpful about this model is it reminds us that we don't all make decisions the exact same way. Some of us, you can bring information to it, present it to them, boom, they'll make a decision right then and there, by having conversations and looking at what you have. Other people, they're going to need that time alone to really think about the decisions and what that means and what the options are. So that this is an important tool to remember as you're thinking about how your loved one might make decisions. And I can send you a link that's got a little bit more information about this decision making style stuff. Awesome. Thanks everybody for typing in the box. So icebreakers, there's a lot of different icebreakers that we could use to just open the door to this conversation. So you might say something like, do you remember Mary? Mary's mom just had a stroke recently, and I've been thinking a lot about like what I would want to do in this situation. And then you might say, what do you think? So you're not actively asking them about, okay, if we ended up in a really complicated health situation, what would you want done? You're just, for yourself, you're just opening the door so they can think about someone else. And that can be a very helpful way to open the door, because oftentimes when we think about our own frailty, our own death and dying, we shut down and we don't want to talk about it. But if we talk about someone else's frailty or death and dying or injury, sometimes it can be a little bit easier. A plot in a movie can also be a really good tool to kind of help open the door to the conversation. So Steel Magnolias, type in the box yes if you've seen Steel Magnolias. We got some yeses. So that was a movie about a young woman who had very severe diabetes. So that movie, if you happen to watch it, and there's other movies like it, another one might be P.S. I Love You. You can watch these movies that kind of address some of these more difficult topics for folks, really emotional topics, and then use that as, what would you do in that situation? Or I would do this in that situation, to start those conversations, to make it easier to open the door, to hopefully get them talking. And as Jane and I've kind of said, maybe it's going to be, hey, what would you do about this movie? And that's all the conversation that happens at that one place in time. But that's okay. Some people, many of us, need more time. And as we think about that conversation, we may come back and have more conversation. So it's using these icebreakers to get it going. Development of personal plans. I'm a huge, huge, huge advocate of adult children having their own house in order before approaching their parents. So, I'm curious. Me personally, I recently wrote my will, and I wrote my funeral plans out. I'm 37, and I am attempting to have conversations with my parents about, okay, so, my dad is 70 and my mom is 64. And, I live here, they live in Florida. So I am trying to have these conversations with my parents about, okay, how do we want this last third of life to look? At the end of the day, I want their life to, be good, be enjoyable for as long as possible. So having our own house in order with respect to our advanced health care plan, our wills, our estate plans, all the different planning documents that we need to have in place, I think that's an extremely powerful way, because you might say, hey, I just developed my will. I'd like to share some of the content. You don't have to share the whole will, but maybe you share some of the content. Or I developed my funeral plan. And, do you remember, like in mine, I've got a playlist of music. Do you remember this song from whatever? Well, that's in my funeral plan, and I'd like it played. So you could have your own plans and try to use that as a way to start that conversation. And then leading questions are another way. You could say something like, I'd really like your help understanding something, and then go into the topic that you're trying to explore, or I really would like to help to understand your wishes in a given situation. You can use those questions, those leading, statements to kind of start the conversation. So for our next slide, I would like each of you to read these 6 sentences and imagine that someone is saying them to you. And I want to know how that would make you feel. So I'm going to give you about a minute, and I want you to look at these sentences as they're being said to you, and how would that make you feel? Type your responses in the box. Anger, loss of control, left out. Yep. Belittled, that's a good one too. Disrespected control, I want to make my own decisions. Anybody else want to share? I'll give you like another 10 seconds. Too much should, yes. What's disturbing is that these are sentences that are often said to people in these difficult conversations. And, you know, several of you captured some of the emotions: guilt, criticism or judgment, dishonesty or secrecy, false promises. You know, these statements really, I mean, you think about how you felt reading them. You know, when somebody says statements like this to an adult that they're trying to have a conversation with, it often just puts up a huge barrier and a huge wall, and it really can just be a conversation killer. You know, so some different examples of statements that might be better. I know you thought things would turn out different. Another one, I hadn't looked at it that way before, could show some respect. To show acceptance, you might say, I know that you're doing everything you can to manage, and I respect you for that. Returning control, how we might return control. How would you like to manage the upkeep of your home? You know, so for example, if we have an older adult that it's just getting to be a little bit too much to mow and shovel snow, and, you know, maybe do laundry going up and down the stairs, just getting to be a little bit too much, you might say, well, how would you like to manage? Instead of like, well, you need to do this, you know, so, or you should do this. So that's very helpful. So I versus you statements, they are very powerful tools when we're communicating with other people. When we use I statements, we're taking responsibility for how we feel about a given situation. You know, so for example, if our adult parent has fallen, you might say something like, you know, I'm concerned that I won't have much time left with you. You could try that approach. When you use you statements, they sound like blaming and accusations. And often when, you know, you're going to die again if you fall, you know, or if you, try that again. You're going to die if you fall again. You know, those are two very different statements, and they can really, when you say a you statement like that, it can really pull out defensiveness and close people off. So, important thing to do is how to flip the you statements. And even though technically 6 is not like a you statement per se, in some ways it is. All right, so you statements, they express how you feel, a true you statement. So I feel joyful, I feel anxious, I feel lonely, I feel resentful, I feel angry. Those are you statements. But just because, or excuse me, I statements, but just because we slap an I on the front of a statement doesn't mean that it's not a you statement. So for example, there's some words that will imply action or activity on another person. So I feel annoyed, I feel ignored, I feel mistreated, I feel manipulated. Those are actually you statements in disguise. They are placing active blame for what happened on the other person. It's also a misperception that you can just say I feel, and all of a sudden you've turned a you statement into a I statement. So for example, I feel like you are taking me for granted, you know. So, all right, let's move on to active listening. And I did see the question earlier. The slides will be emailed out after the webinar. So active listening, this is a really helpful model to remember as, you know, we're working through these difficult conversations. So we have to pay attention. You know, we can't have a phone out, we can't have the TV on, we can't sit there and mentally prepare what we're going to say to that person if we are going to engage in actively paying attention. So show you're listening. Use eye contact, you know, I'll say, yes, I understand, nod, so the person knows that you're listening to them. Provide feedback about what they're saying. Paraphrase back what they said to you before you respond to them to ensure that you have a good understanding of what was actually said. You know, so if your parent is talking about how much they don't want to be in a nursing home, how much it costs, you know, you might say, it sounds like you want to stay in your home. And then you try to move from there. Defer judgment. It's important that you are curious about another person's point of view. And this is linked to that first one. You know, if you're interrupting, it's going to send a signal that you're not actually listening, preparing to respond to them if you're trying to interrupt people. You know, so defer the judgment of what they're saying, really focus on what exactly is this person saying to us. And at the end of the day, these difficult conversations are often with people we love very, very much. So we want that conversation to go as well as possible. And respond appropriately. You know, so our goal as we're having these conversations is to increase our understanding of what our parent has done, you know, and maybe what their fears and concerns and worries are, so that we have a better understanding as a family, as people who love each other, of, you know, the priorities. So this is a good little model to keep in mind, that if we pay attention, show we're listening, provide feedback, defer the judgment, and respond appropriately, conversations hopefully will go better. I mean, we're always situations where we may not respond appropriately. You know, we're not feeling it well. There's going to be those moments when we have an inappropriate response, you know, but at the end of the day, you know, if our goal is genuinely to ensure that our loved ones can live the life that they want through the end of their lifetime here on this earth, then I think they will know that. We all make mistakes, we're human. So the adult and parent relationship. This is a really, really important topic that needs the reminder, you know, we should never think of our older parent as a child. It does not matter what they can or cannot do. At the end of the day, our parent remains an adult. So we have to respect their autonomy. You know, they have a right to make decisions. And possibly one of the hardest things to hear is they have a right to fail. We hope that our loved ones will make decisions that will allow them to enjoy life for as long as possible. But there are some people who won't talk about it. I actually was at an event a couple of weeks ago talking about this webinar, inviting the gentleman to attend. And it was very clear to me that the idea of talking about death and dying and end of life was very uncomfortable for him. Maybe he'll change his mind, but at the end of the day, just some people will not talk about it. And we have to accept that. No matter how many limitations our adult loved one may have, we want to consult them as much as possible in decision making. There's this syndrome called transfer trauma. And essentially, when we take a frail adult and move them from wherever they're currently living to a new location, they have some pretty significant symptoms appear. Could be dementia. Some of these folks die prematurely. And what we know about this transfer trauma is that if we consult them as much as possible, give them as much control, decision-making capacity as possible, that they are more resilient when they're moved from one location to the other. So involving our older parent in these decisions makings is extremely critical. And then we want them to remain as independent as possible. There are all sorts of ways that adults that are experiencing, frailty, complicated illnesses can still contribute. So finding those opportunities, it could be stuffing letters, it could be, helpful laundry, but finding those things. So the big takeaway here is, even if your aging parent develops dementia, they are still a parent. They do not become a child, ever. They are an adult. So in summary, many of us put off the difficult conversations for many reasons, which forces many of us to make those decisions during a crisis. When we make decisions in a crisis, our options for ourselves and our loved one are so much more limited. By avoiding these conversations, we can have family conflict. There's this assumption that family knows what our preferences are. Unfortunately, it's not true very often. And there's often arguments among family members about what someone would have wanted if that conversation never took place. So having these conversations helps reduce the risk that we're going to cause permanent damage to some of our family relationships, for the people who survive after we're gone. And making sure that our loved ones know our preferences, and it's probably the greatest gift that we can give to our loved ones. If they know what we want, then there's no doubt in their mind that they're doing the right thing as they make decisions on our behalf, So this stuff is exceptionally important. It's difficult, but we highly encourage these conversations to take place. As I've said, I've got a will, I've got a funeral plan written. I still got to, set up the payment for that, but I'm getting these things in place at 37 because I feel that these are not topics just for older adults. These are topics for all adults, because our time on this earth is limited, and we will all face some sort of challenges as we get near to the end of our life. So these conversations are how we ensure that our loved ones and ourselves have the best possible experience with that end of life part. So now, what questions does the group have? Or comments? Or if anybody has a story that they want to share, you're welcome to unmute yourself and talk about an experience where you've seen either, difficult conversations gone well or difficult conversations gone bad. Anybody got a short story they want to share?
I could just ask, this is Michelle May. For example, I've heard a lot of what you're saying today. I've utilized that with my father. He's very receptive. He's very open to the conversation, but not necessarily the follow through. Do you have kind of that addendum and how we can circle back still with love and care and concern when things aren't kind of being followed through on?
That's a really excellent question. Jane, do you want to start?
Well, I was just curious of maybe just the area where you're looking for some follow through. Is it more on his health or some other topics that you've been talking about moving forward on?
To be honest with you, it would be his health. It would also be his living conditions. Those are the two primary right now where we just are sensing hesitation on follow through.
Sure. Well, certainly the health is, whether it's following some of the doctor's orders or some of those behaviors that you know would help him feel better. Those can be difficult, and usually it's you know, a healthcare provider or somebody that they'll look to for advice. Oftentimes it's not the family member or the adult children that they might listen to in that. So I mean, I would certainly engage if they're going to their appointments with their provider, just to kind of talk about those things and have them kind of re-emphasize those actions that they are, the follow-up, the things that they should be doing. That would be helpful. The living conditions, whether it's, you know, needing to get some help inside the home, a lot of people refuse that, or maybe looking at someplace else, you know, moving to someplace else, is maybe just trying to break it down to some very small steps. You know, what would be the next thing if you would just wanted to have that follow-up conversation? What is one thing we could do about, you know, maybe he needs a housekeeper to come in just to keep the house cleaner and tidy or whatever, just to talk about what would be the next steps, you know, who would be available, what would it be cost, and try to break it down. Because sometimes when we need to do things, well, sometimes we don't see it ourselves, but also if it might seem overwhelming, just to break it down, what would be that next step, and have that conversation. And then I'll just have to follow up and to say that sometimes that when we're talking about, you know, aging adults, that they have their choice to not do anything. I mean, we would like them to follow the plans that we would think would be best for them, but that isn't always the case. I think the biggest thing is when we're wanting our family members to do something because we think it would be safer for them. You know, maybe moving out of their house to an assisted living or someplace because it would be safer. Well, that's a choice for that individual, whether they want to choose that or not. And sometimes that's hard for us to accept at times. I don't know that I could answer your specific question, but I hope that maybe it was a little bit helpful.
Well, I've got a couple things to add. Michelle, are you the primary caregiver? Do you live near your father?
No, my sister lives 3 hours from my father, and I am 10.
Okay. Because one thing, you know, one angle you might try is, you know, it would help me out, you know, or something, like frame it as it's going to help somebody else as opposed to helping him.
Sure.
You know, that may be one thing. And another thing I was going to touch on is, you know, I wish I could remember where I saw it, but safety is not a high priority for most older adults. They don't care about safety. We care about them being safe, but they don't care. They just want, you know, they want to live their life. So, you know, I was just thinking, as much as important as safety is, safety isn't necessarily the word that's going to inspire action, because they don't care.
Correct.
So that I would, that's a good one to keep in mind. And yeah, you could try flipping it as it's going to help somebody else. Sometimes that's the approach that works.
The other thing that is sometimes helpful, if we're looking at somebody in very advanced ages, some of the things that are very important to them are just maintaining their life. And maybe maintaining their life is that they're going to be able to stay in their house. They're still going to be able to drive, maybe be strong enough to go walk down the driveway and get their mail every day, and to cook. And so sometimes if we're needing to, you know, maybe encourage people to continue to do something, whether it's physical therapy or something that's like, this is going to help you to be able to, you know, walk and get to your grandkids' baseball game or basketball game, or be able to go to church because that's important to you. So some of those maintenance of their daily life, whatever their daily life, what's important to them, if you can relate it to that, that might be something that will motivate them.
That's a great ad, Jane. Thank you. Does anyone else have any questions or comments? Well, Jane and I are very excited that you all joined us today. We both have websites that you can visit, and there will be another webinar on November 8th called Senior Moments and Other Misnomers About the Aging Brain. We're going to spend a lot of time talking about how the brain changes and why joking about memory loss as a part of getting older could be problematic for ourselves or the people we love. So we invite you to join us for that one as well. This webinar was recorded. We will send the link out to everybody who registered once it's available. Again, we appreciate your time and we hope you enjoy the rest of your week.